this evening I'm going to talk to you about why wild bees matter. And I say wild bees as opposed to honeybees, but from the outset, I'm sure we've probably got some beekeepers in the audience this evening. This isn't a honeybee bashing exercise or anything. It's just merely levitating the importance of wild bees as opposed to trying to crush the importance of honeybees. Oh, here we go. First glitch. Right, let's go there. So yes, as John said, at the moment I work for Wild Oxfordshire, which is a local conservation charity, and we don't own any land or manage it, but we do support those that do, and we offer bespoke advice to community groups, local environment groups, and parish councils who want to manage their land for biodiversity, for nature. Bees tend to be my sort of, I guess, introductory level with the groups, because saving our pollinators and planting and managing land for pollinators and bees is something that almost all of us can do. So I think it's a really good introduction. The other thing, we work in the Evenlow catchment as the partnership host there, and we do a lot of strategic work with local authorities in Oxfordshire. In 2017, you may have seen the publication of the State of Nature in Oxfordshire report. If you haven't read it, it is, it's, I guess, 3 years out of date now, but I don't think much has changed really. And you can download that from our website free of charge. And in last year, we worked with these organisations in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide to develop a nature recovery network for Oxfordshire. And that has gone into the OP 2050 report, OP 2050, Oxfordshire Plan 2050, to help Oxfordshire plan for the future, in theory, with nature, with biodiversity and natural capital at the heart of decision making. But we are here this evening I'm here to talk about wild bees. In 2016, IPBES produced this fantastic document all about pollinators and food production. And I'm not going to dwell on it this evening because you can download it and read it for yourselves, but it really is an excellent read. And it summarizes pretty much everything you need to know about food production and pollination and the state of pollination. But I suppose the highlights are, it highlights the importance of pollinators and that they are global ecological keystones. 90% of wild flowering plants are pollinated by animals. So obviously when we think of pollinators in this country, we think of insects, but across the world, as I'm sure you know, bats and birds and other mammals, bats and other mammals are also pollinators. And 75% of our global food crops need some sort of animal pollination. And not only is it sort of bulk of our food requires animal pollination, but it's those foods that really have very important nutrients for us that we wouldn't necessarily get from plants that are pollinated by wind, and also fibers such as flax and medicines. And the global economic value of pollinators in 2015, was enormous. It was up to $577 billion. And in the UK, it looks for around £430 million. So they're very valuable for many reasons. And I like this slide because it sort of gives you a visual idea of what pollinators mean to us. Obviously, honeybees make honey, but all those lovely fruit and veg that we take for granted have all been pollinated. And our lovely gardens, domestic plant communities that we derive so much enjoyment from, Most of those flowers, those flowering plants, are pollinated by insects. We also have our wildflower meadows, which not only look lovely, but they provide really important ecosystem services. They support other insects, they store carbon, they, what else? They provide forage for livestock, and they filter our water. And pollinators also provide food for biodiversity, for other animals, such as berries for birds and berries for small mammals. And there are even birds such as great tits that actually eat bees. That's not a great tit, that's a bee eater. But I couldn't find a photo of a great tit eating a bee. And then, not so much in our, well, I suppose maybe in our culture, pollinators are very important sort of symbols, spiritual symbols. They are aesthetically pleasing. There are lots of people who enjoy watching butterflies and bees. So, lost my slides, hang on. Yikes. Sorry, John, my slides have disappeared. What has gone on here? There we go, back. Ugh. Right, back on track. So we are aware of the fact that there is a problem with the decline of pollinators, but just how bad is that problem? Well, the clever folk at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology have developed biodiversity indicators that illustrate the change in distribution of biodiversity. And and they've done this for all sorts of organisms, but I just picked out the sort of pollinator ones. They don't derive these figures from abundance. It's they basically divide the UK up into 1K grid, into 1K grid cells. And they look at the occupancy of those cells of different species. And these are all derived from recording groups data. Basically, they show that overall pollinators are becoming more restricted in their distribution. So on average, in any one place, the diversity of pollinator species is found to have been reduced. So, it's done it again. So, for butterflies, the indicator has shown that there's a 71% decrease in butterfly occurrence, 39% in hoverflies, and 17% for wild bees. Some wild bee species have actually increased and many have decreased. And again, I put the reference at the bottom of the slide. If anyone's really interested and is really good with stats, have a look at that, because it's a great paper. So what do we mean when we talk about bees, particularly in the UK? Well, we've got about just over 270 species. And I think you can see my mouse, but so these are all solitary bees, the first 5 families. And then we've got 27 species of bumblebees, and there's only 1 species of honeybee. So when we think of, when we, in our heads, when we think about bees, it's normally bumblebees and honeybees, but there's so many others as well, which go about their business sort of quietly and not being noticed. Actually, what I should say about that previous slide, what's interesting about the previous slide, if you look at these decreases, this percentage decrease, this is between 1980 and 2016. So this isn't even since 1066 or whatever, this is really recently. So the baseline was probably already pretty low, but just the data to do the really thorough analysis wasn't available. Okay, so we've got our hang on, turn that off. We've got our 270 species of bee. We've got one domestic species, that's the honeybee. And maybe that we shouldn't really worry. We've got the honeybee, it produces honey, it pollinates. And do we really need to worry about the other 269 species? Well, we do, because they all carry out their sort of life histories in a slightly different way, and they perform pollination in a slightly different way as well. So, for example, bumblebees and honeybees collect pollen. They fly from plant to plant, flower to flower, collecting pollen on their furry bodies. And they're quite efficient foragers. So what they do is they scrape the pollen, they groom the pollen off their bodies and down into their pollen baskets. And I'm sure you've all seen bees flying around with these huge kind of dollops of pollen on their legs. And that makes the bees really efficient. They collect the pollen and they take most of it back to their nests and feed their larvae. But what it does mean is that the pollen is kind of locked away on their legs and not so available for transfer from flower to flower. Solitary bees, on the other hand, don't have such a sophisticated system. And so in your solitary bees, for example, you've got mining bees, which carry their loose, dry pollen on their legs. So you can see the top photo there, the sort of aggregation of pollen on the legs. And leafcutter bees have got this kind of incredible brush underneath their bodies where they put pollen in there. But it's not wet, it's dry pollen. They haven't kind of secreted oils and used the oils to pat the pollen into balls. It's very dry, which means it's much more transferable. And this means that from a plant's perspective, they are actually really good pollinators. And also from humans' perspective, if you want something pollinated, you need an efficient transfer of pollen. So this means that actually solitary bees are in fact better pollinators than honeybees or bumblebees. And in a study, again, by Ben Woodcock from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, he looked at oilseed rape pollination and saw that actually solitary bees visiting oilseed rape had just over a 71% chance of pollen transfer from their bodies onto a plant, whereas it was half that for bumblebees and honeybees. So you're probably thinking, okay, well, maybe we can just get by with solitary bees, but actually that's not the case, because bumblebees have this incredible trick up their sleeve which we can't live without. So pollen for plants is incredibly expensive to produce. It's very rich in protein. And so what plants need to do is make sure that their pollen is not wasted. So blueberries and tomatoes and aubergines, for example, have evolved a way of retaining their pollen until a pollinator that is very consistent in its foraging comes along. So bumblebees, what they can do is, so if a honeybee flies to a tomato plant, it can't get the pollen out. But bumblebees have got this amazing, you know, how you can hear them buzzing, and that is their wing muscles vibrating. They've got this amazing band of muscle between the bases of their wings, and they come along and they grab hold of the anthers of the flower with their legs and anchor themselves down with their mouth, and they vibrate their wings, and this causes the anthers basically to break open, called dehiscence, and release the pollen onto their bodies. And this is buzz pollination. And really the only other way to achieve buzz pollination is with a tuning fork at the right, that is of the right frequency. So this buzz pollination causes this huge explosion of pollen which goes onto the bumblebees' bodies. And this is particularly used in the commercial growth of tomatoes in polytunnels. And Europe, well, that's in Europe and South America and North America, and in Australia, because they don't have their own bumblebees, and they're not allowed to import them, they use the blue-banded bee, which is a type of Australian bee. And so honeybees and solitary bees are unable to do this. So bumblebees play a very important role in our lives. Sorry, I should have had my other mouse. So this is just a very quick slide to show you some of the fruits which wild bees are the most effective pollinators of. So if you're going to farm these fruits, you really want to get wild bees in here. So what are the causes of the declines? Well, unsurprisingly, they are the causes of declines of many forms of biodiversity, but basically habitat loss, the use of pesticides, disease, and possibly the interaction of all of the above with climate change. And the man on the right is pollinating pears in Sichuan in China with a sort of long stick with cigarette ends stuck, the filters of cigarettes stuck on the end of his cane, because it's much cheaper to pay people to do it than to move colonies of honeybees around, and they have no more wild bees left. So our loss of quality habitat is caused by pretty much agricultural intensification. And since 1930, we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows. And also lots of lovely hedgerows have been removed to create larger, more homogeneous fields. Agri-environment schemes have created 6,500 hectares of insect habitat, which is just under 0.3%. And then a few more areas have been recreated through conservation efforts. So that photo top right, bucolic scene, is pretty much what bumblebees and other sort of wild bees would love. So a mosaic of sort of hedgerows, woodland and wildflower meadows, and the absence of insecticides. And what we have these days, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is just huge open areas of farmland with very efficient food production, which of course we need. And also another scene that's probably familiar to you is huge swathes of oilseed rape, which come not only is it, I mean, it's to a certain degree, it's a very small flash of nectar and pollen for bees, but as you know, that's only very brief. But it also, unfortunately, the seed, until a few years ago, came drenched in something called neonicotinoids, which were used from 2002 to treat flea beetle. And what's interesting, I suppose in a way, what's very clever and brilliant invention about neonics is that they are applied to the seed of oilseed rape, and as the plant grows, the chemical is taken up within the plant. So it meant that you didn't have to use sort of spray across the crop. It comes from within, which is incredibly clever. But unfortunately, it then comes out. It grows out of the plant and into the pollen and the nectar, so that anything foraging on that plant will consume the neonics. And although they are not necessarily lethal to bees, so you don't end up with huge piles of dead bees. What you do get is bees that sort of can no longer function normally. It shortens the lives of honeybees, and it suppresses their reproductive success. Anyway, this was, again, some great work by CEH. Have summarized this if you want to read more. And in 2013, the EU banned the use on flowering crops, and in 2018, the ban was extended and I think can now only be used in permanent greenhouses. And disease, like anything else, any other organism, bees have parasites. and diseases, and they can normally sort of live with them, unless they come under other pressures, um, such as being exposed to pesticides or lack of food, or long periods of bad weather, and then suddenly these diseases become a bit more of a problem. And there's been recent work to show that honeybees, their diseases spill over into wild bees, which is really unfortunate, especially as sometimes honeybee colonies are kept are not kept so well, and if they're poorly cared for and disease becomes a problem and no one treats them, then obviously they're going to transmit diseases to wild bees. And there's also a commercial trade in captive bumblebees that come over from Europe, that aren't necessarily screened for disease as rigorously as they should be. And then, of course, that makes disease transmission species, from bumblebee to bumblebee is quite easy. And really sadly, this is in South America, where they have a very low diversity of bumblebee, but they also have, I think, are the biggest bumblebee, fabulous big orange thing. The South Americans obviously want to grow their own tomatoes, but have quite a limited bumblebee population. So they import these captive bred bees from Europe, and again, with pretty devastating impacts from the disease that have been brought in, which South America's native bees did not have any immunity to. So, so what is the solution to all of this? Well, it's not moving huge amounts of honeybees around, like what happens in California, or even what sometimes happens in our apple orchards in this country. Honeybees are not necessarily the solution. In fact, they're not the solution at all. We need to really nurture our wild bees. And what I sometimes compare this with, if you wanted to save birds, all our wild birds, releasing chickens is not going to help. You have chickens if you want eggs. If you want honey, you keep honeybees, but they are not the solution to the pollination crisis. So ideally, what we should be doing is sort of reverting huge swathes of the countryside to flower-rich meadows, interspersed with woodlands and ponds and hedgerows. And obviously that wouldn't just solve the problem of pollinators, it would help biodiversity and climate change and everything. But that's probably a long way off at the moment, and I'm not sure whether that's within the audience's capacity either. So I thought what I'd do is focus a bit more on what we can do in our gardens and at a community level as well. So do something, I think, rather than doing nothing. And we need to create more flower-rich patches and provide undisturbed nest sites and hibernation sites for our bees and other pollinators and other animals altogether, and provide a refuge from pesticides, and contribute towards the monitoring and recording, and obviously get the children, get the young people involved and interested as well. And so whether you're a farmer and a landowner, or whether you own a garden or an allotment, if you want to help bees, you need to understand, I think, a lot about what they need and why they need it. So this is, for example, the bumblebee's life cycle. So right now we are going into winter, and what we see is the queens who have mated in late autumn going into hibernation, and all the males and all the workers from the colony die off, and all you're left with is a mated queen. And she will find a sort of quiet, dry, cool space to hibernate in. They don't like it too warm. If the space is sort of on a sunny bank or something like that, they end up waking up too early. And they will emerge in the spring, maybe in February or March, and they need to forage. So bees need pollen and they need nectar, and they need pollen because it's really rich in protein to feed their larvae and for growth. And they need nectar. Basically, nectar is the kind of petrol that keeps them moving, that keeps them able to forage for the pollen, although they do feed some of the nectar to the larvae. So very early in spring, if you really want to plant for bees, you need to supply some flowering plants that will come out in February and March. And so once the queen has got herself up and running and in good condition, she will find a nest site, maybe a vole hole or a crack in a pavement or under a shed. And she will found the nest and start laying fertilized eggs. And the fertilized eggs become workers. And the queen will go out and forage to feed the larvae of her sort of her first round of eggs. And what will happen is eventually she'll start to lose condition, and because she's flying and going in and out of the nest hole, her wings will become frayed, and at some point she will no longer be able to fly and provide for the nest. But that doesn't matter, because by that point the larvae have turned into workers, and now the workers go off and do the foraging and collect the nectar and the pollen for the new larvae. And the queen will carry on laying fertilized eggs until she runs out of sperm that was stored from the previous autumn. And once she runs out of sperm, she will start laying unfertilized eggs, and they will hatch and become the males. So in the spring and summer, she will need, what's happening in the spring and summer is that the nest is reaching maximum sort of production, and that's when they will, lots of workers will need lots of nectar to keep them flying, and there'll be huge amounts of larvae in the nest which will need feeding with pollen. So spring, summer, you need to have a garden full of lots and lots of flowering plants. And by the late summer, what happens is the new males start emerging from the nests, as do new queens, and they mate, and the whole life cycle starts again. All the males die, and the new queens go into hibernation, and all the workers die off as well. So that's the life cycle. So you really need to provide them with forage through an awful lot of the year. I mean, kind of by November, December, January, there probably aren't that many, there shouldn't be many bees flying unless it's a particularly warm winter. So the next thing you need to think about is bee tongue length. So I've got a list here down the left-hand side of some bee species. So these are bumblebees. The first three are bumblebees. Apis mellifera is the honeybee. The top three bumblebees are known as our long-tongued bumblebees. Bombus hortorum, which is the one on the right. You can see its long tongue coming out there. It's just flying in to feed on some Aquilegia nectar. Has a 14-millimeter long tongue. And Apis mellifera, the honeybee, has got a 7-millimeter long tongue. And Andrena, for example, which are mining bees, have got much shorter tongues. And you need to provide forage for all of these, a range of forage, because a long-tongued bee trying to feed on a very open flower like this echinacea is a really awkward thing to watch. Its tongue is too long, and it has to rear up on its legs to kind of get enough sort of suction to suck up the nectar. But similarly, a short-tongued bee trying to get into a flower with a deep corolla is also quite it's very difficult. What they've ended up doing is learning to bite a hole in the bottom of the corolla where the nectary is, around there. So if you can supply a range of deep corollid and very open flowers and everything in between, then you should have your wild bees covered. So, for example, let's have a look. So this is the kind of forage you should be supplying in your garden to cover all bees throughout the year. So Mahonia is a fantastic early, really early, sometimes that's out when it's snowing. Mahonia and crocuses and willow is a fantastic resource for early flowering resource for wild bees. Lots of pollen very early on in the season, and pulmonaria. And then in the summer, I mean, you almost can't go wrong if you just, as long as you've got flowers in your garden, it'll appeal to someone. But here's another long-tongued bee going in for an aquilegia, the cotoneasters. You often see those. That's a Bombus praetorum, that's an early bumblebee feeding on the cotoneaster, and geraniums. Is that a lupin for long-tongued bees? Here's a long-tongued bee on honeysuckle and sedums. So by the end of early autumn, late summer, sedums are a fantastic resource for the males, as are thistles as well. Some toadflax and echinacea. So bedding plants are not much good, really. They have been bred for their colours and their size. They tend to be sterile hybrids with no pollen and no scent. And unfortunately, they also often get drenched in insecticides so that they come out looking sort of perfect. And as you know, they tend to arrive in plastic trays and they cost a lot of money. So if you want to choose, don't choose them. Choose something more perennial and more nectar and pollen rich. And the other thing we need to do is provide them with sort of undisturbed nest sites. So I was astounded to see this for £17. Ceramic bumblebee nester. They just don't work. I think bumblebees, the harder you try to supply them somewhere to live, the more they'll ignore it. They're quite contrary that way. So don't waste your money on that. But again, you need to know a little bit more about where bumblebees and wild bees do nest. So bumblebees can broadly be divided into cavity nesters and surface nesters. So these are the cavity nesters, and you will see them swarming around bird boxes. This is our newest species, Bombus hypnorum, that came over from France probably about 20 years ago, and has worked its way up north. And they tend to be the bees that we get lots of reports of because they love bird boxes. But then Bombus lapidarius, as the name suggests, sort of is quite an excavator, and they can often be seen nesting in that gap between where your pipe comes out, where the tap comes out of the wall that you plug the hose into. They kind of excavate down the side of that. And then in graveyards and under sheds, you get Bombus terrestris and Leucorum. And the nests tend to be small, maximum 200 individuals at any one time. They're really not aggressive. Vole holes they love as well, old little mouse holes and rabbit holes and things like that they love. So just leave them in peace and they will go away pretty quickly. And even Bombus hypnorum, people often think they're swarming. But they're not. Those are just males aggregating around the entrance of and males don't sting. So they're not, you mustn't worry about that. And surface nesters are, for example, the brown-banded carder bee. They nest in the base of tussocky grass and I suppose just under hedgerows or wherever you get an accumulation of dry grass and moss, and they just pull together the sort of fibrous material and pull them kind of over the top of the nest, and they just nest on the surface. And obviously they're really quite prone to overzealous raking and strimming and that kind of activity. And then the mining bees and the solitary bees, they tend to, because they don't really buzz and they don't, there's not a lot of traffic, they tend to get overlooked. But sometimes when you go to football pitches, sports fields and things, you can see these sort of funny little volcanoes of earth, and those are mining bees. And mason bees also, they quite like excavating mortar between bricks, but unless you're really lucky, you tend not to get huge aggregations of them. And in just another thing, this is leafcutter bees. If you ever see your rose bushes covered in these strange bite marks, they tend to be leafcutter bees doing that. Don't worry about it. I think try and live with that. Don't persecute the leafcutter bees because they're fantastic creatures. And or you could provide if you want to go if you don't want to everyone should supply nesting habitat in the form of sort of wild area of their garden, and then you can go a little further and maybe provide a bee hotel. And these wonderful big these big fancy ones sorry, big fancy ones are excellent. I think they're kind of unnecessary, but if you want a statement bee hotel, then go for it. I mean, they can be as fancy as you like, or just a bundle of canes or hogweed stems will suffice. Probably not one for the garden, but if you've got a sort of community space, then you could take inspiration from Judy Webb and OCV in the Millenford Nature Park in Oxford, who, having worked really hard to provide sort of pollinator habitat on what was a sort of vast expanse of mown and rolled grass, they worked really hard to create some wildflower areas there. They then decided that they were going to build a bee bank, create a bee bank so that solitary bees had somewhere to nest. And I think that's been really quite successful. So if you if you feel so inclined, contact Judy for information on how they did that. So beyond your garden, I know Wantage is quite active through the Letcombe Brook project and the work that Mark Bradfield does. There's a sort of general fantastic community action spirit down there. So think about your playing fields and churchyards and schools. Where else can you influence? Where can you get public spaces to be a bit more bee friendly? Bottom right is Chipping Norton Health Centre. So when I'm sure some of you know Craig Blackwell, who was a county ecologist for many years, when he saw the plans for the brand new health centre's garden, he was mildly horrified that the garden looked as though it was going to be sort of evergreen shrubs. And so he took on the design of the garden and made this fantastic border full of nectar and pollen-rich plants. And we took the idea with Craig and the Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment and rolled it out to 3 other health centres in Oxfordshire. Bottom left is a churchyard in Norfolk that I was working on. That I've helped sort of retrieve it from this sort of hideous cycle of constant mowing, and it hasn't been seeded or anything, so we just let it grow. This is probably after about 6 years of relaxed mowing regime, and it's just a sea of bedstraw and knapweed. And also for areas that are mown, if there's this sort of fantastic concept of bee lawns. If you can't bear to have long grass, then if you create bee lawns, the clover and the prunella and the lotus here don't mind. They respond quite well to be mown reasonably frequently. and it's just this wonderful flowering lawn. And of course, road verges. I'm not sure what goes on in Wantage with regards to road verges, but if you can get your parish council to take on the management of road verges, then you can do great things. This verge here on the right is near Watlington, that's managed as a road verge nature reserve, and you can see it's got scabious and knapweed, lady's bed straw, and it really is. And of course, with the hedgerow down the side of it, this is just a fantastic kind of corridor for not just pollinators, but other insects and birds, mammals. And I mentioned get involved in recording. There's all sorts of really fantastic citizen science projects and recording groups that if you're interested, there's a recording group for everything, and a sort of citizen science app for pretty much everything as well. So these are just a few. If you want to find out more, probably go to the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, or the Biological Records Centre website. And planting for pollinators, there's also some brilliant resources out there. Bumblebee Conservation Trust have some really brilliant information. If you want to keep honeybees and do it really well, then speak to the British Beekeepers Association. They've got a really good mentoring scheme, and they're really aware of problems that spin out of lack of understanding of how to keep honeybee colonies responsibly. Caring for God's Acre have got brilliant management plans for churchyards, and this book on this book on the right has got pretty much, you can download that from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology's website, and it's got pretty much everything you need to know about wildflower meadow creation. It's not really for gardeners at all, but seed mixes and meadow management and creation, it's all in there, and it's free, and it's really good. And I think that's probably about it. Thank you for listening.
Roselle, that was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I said at the start, we were lucky to have you, and not just because I know how absolutely flat out busy you are with your work, but that was just such a brilliant expert talk on a subject which it comes across just how much compassion and feeling you have for the bees. You really do care about the subject. So thank you very, very much indeed for giving us such a great talk. And maybe if Faith is online, I did see one question coming by.
I think it was more a comment we had, but perhaps I could just ask one question. Have you seen any benefits from the ban on neonicotinoids yet, or is it too early to say?
I think it may be too early to say. I suppose that will be coming through, you know, in through the records, I guess. But you know, keep an eye on Ben Woodcock at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, because he's sort of all over that. And I guess if anyone could notice sort of a change as a result of that legislation, then he probably would. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have got, I thought we had some wonderful suggestions there that we could do as a community and as well as individuals, so that's great. Yeah, we'll have to follow some of those up. So there's a comment from June Grumwald who says there's a bee hotel in the car park at Aldi and Farringdon. I don't know if you knew that, other people knew that, but that's nice.
Other supermarkets are available, whether or not they've got.
Yes, yeah. Some positive comments coming. There's a question here: are daffodils and snowdrops any good for early spring foraging?
Yes, they are actually. You just have to be careful with bulbs, particularly planting new bulbs that they, I think, because they are not flowering. Now, what are the rules? But basically, if you buy bulbs from Holland, they often come soaked in neonics. There's some weird kind of, it's not a dodge or anything, it just wasn't kind of clarified in legislation. So you just have to try and do a bit of research before buying huge amounts of bulbs and planting them for pollinators. But there are, I suppose, I think they're organic. I think they're called organic bulbs. You can get them. So yes, I think aconites and snowdrops are a bit better than daffodils. I think daffodils often are more popular with beetles, and I guess the more purer, the more wild type, the more closer to wild type the daffs are, probably the better they are.
Okay, someone asks, are there carpenter bees in the UK?
Not that I'm aware. I think every so often we may get one or two. Hang on, I've got my bee book right here. If you need a bee book, you can do a lot worse than The Field Guide to Bees by Stephen Falk.
Thank you.
And it's pretty scary. It's full of pages and pages of brown bees. But if you want to challenge yourself, this learn. I mean, I can't even. I'm actually, to be honest with you, not very good at bee identification without the book. But you know, it's good. It's a challenge, right? Xylocarpa, large carpenter bees. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So there's a violet carpenter bee sort of in the Thames Valley. I must say, I'm not sure I've ever seen one in this country. Few scattered records. I think they probably blow in rather like butterflies.
Would a carpenter bee actually build something, or would it just eat it?
It'll build a garden shed before living in it.
We've got a query. Someone asks why there's only one species of honeybee in the UK.
Because
are there others available? They're just not here.
There are others available, yeah, absolutely. But I think they're the ones that have been domesticated. Again, it's a honeybee, it's a kind of beekeeper's question. There's all sorts of races of honeybees and bees that have been bred by monks that are meant to be more docile than others. And but I think they were here 9,000 years ago. When we were still attached to Europe, and when the land bridge was there, and I think probably the Romans shifted them around a bit as well. But yeah, just they weren't. Their life cycle is not really adapted to the cold, to our cold weather. They don't do that hibernation thing like the bumblebees do, and which is why they need kind of support through their life cycle. They need to be fed when resources are low, and they need to be medicated, and whereas wild bees just get on with it. They've got no one to look after them. They're very resourceful. Their life cycle is perfectly adapted to our climate. And they're linked so super tightly with the evolution of our sweeter flowering plants as well.
Actually, Faith, forgive me interrupting again.
Yeah.
I was kind of amused, Roselle, when you said we need to think about the length of tongues on bees. I never thought about the length of tongues on bees before, but maybe I will give that some thought in future. And Faith, you said that there were so many good ideas came out of Roselle's talk for what we can do locally. And I was thinking we've got biodiversity royalty on the call in the form of Mark Bradfield, who you mentioned, Roselle, if he's still on the call. Yes, he is. Brilliant.
Well, Mark has actually made a comment saying, do write to the Oxford County Council Highways and VWHDC and ask them to manage their verges in line with the Plant Life campaign. And also Grove Parish Council do manage some of their own verges.
So,
excuse me.
Question from Mark, or two questions from Mark. Mark, what, you've already got one slogan, say no to the mow. Could be active be another slogan in your armory?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I like
Over
it.
to you, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, things are slowly budging. I'm aware Oxfordshire City Council are looking at changing their mowing regimes. And one of the Oxford councillors is going to the Vale to talk to them, I think, this week, to try and encourage reducing the cutting regimes and managing for wildflowers and for pollinators. So, you know, please do encourage them to do so. That would be really good.
And Mark, are there any community spaces of the type that Roselle illustrated that you got your eye on in Wantage?
The problem in Wantage is Wantage don't own hardly anything. So I've already suggested to Wantage Town Council areas that could be managed better for wildflowers and for pollinators. Most of them are owned by the Vale, so we need to get the Vale on side, and at the moment I haven't had a response from them. It's been a really difficult year to try and get change because I think everybody has been somewhat distracted by COVID, and you know, councillors are having to deal with other things. So it's very slow. We could certainly do more at the cemetery at Chain Hill. Wantage Park could be managed in such a better way. It's if you haven't noticed, there is an amazing corridor around the tennis club, which is packed full of wildflowers. But the rest of the park is absolutely rubbish for pollinators.
Just hang on a sec there. You know I get sensitive
Sorry.
when you talk about Wantage Park.
Yeah.
You're talking about Manor Park, aren't you?
Manor Road Recreation Ground, to give it its full title. There's a small park called Benjamin Park, which is much better for wildflowers and pollinators. You might know that one, John.
Fivers in the post already. Sorry, Faith.
Okay, we've got a recommendation here from Matthew Edwards to grow comfrey, which attracts lots of bees and is obviously, so it's a good food plant for tiger moths and also makes a great liquid plant feed. If anyone watches Gardener's World, they'll know that too. There's a question here from Susie Lapwood saying, we saw lots of long-tongued bees in her garden this spring and summer. Why is this? Might it be to do with our climate or changes in?
It's probably more to do with the fact that there was a nest in or nearby the garden. So when you see with bumblebees, it's quite interesting because if you see 100 bees in your garden, you have no idea whether they are 100 bees from one nest or 100 bees from 100 nests. But if you see a lot of something in your garden, it means that there is probably a nest either, you know, within kind of, I don't know, 400 meters of your garden. So that's probably what it was to do with.
Okay, there's a question. I thought wasps might come up sometime, but anyways, someone asked, do wasps impact on bees or do they cohabit in peace?
As far as I'm aware, they cohabit in peace, unless you've got the the Asian hornets, and then you've got a massive problem, because they will decimate your beehive, because that's what they do. But no, I think they're probably even complementary.
But I guess things like Asian hornets might be more of a problem in future with warmer climate.
Yeah, quite possibly. I can't imagine we'll be able to, keep them out forever.
No.
Faith, can I be a pest and interrupt again? I don't know how many beekeepers there are on the call, but I saw one special, not really a beekeeper, Paulette. I've got you in mind. Seeing you on the call, are you there?
Hi, good evening.
You've got a special interest in beehives. You want to just tell the group?
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, John, for inviting me to join this evening. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much, Roselle, for your talk on bees. Very informative. My interest in bees, I'm currently working with the SDFC Food Network and a group of investigators from the Open University, Warwick University, and SDFC, looking at how we can use technology to help beekeepers monitor bees without disturbing them, and also use the technology to be better informed of potential problems before they occur within the hives. So the type of things that we're looking at is using sensors to place inside the beehives and monitor the humidity, the temperature, the weight of the honey as it's produced, and also using space technology, especially Earth observation data, to identify ideal locations to place hives, and also monitor the environment where the hives are located to assist the beekeeper to know what type of environment is occurring around the hives, i.e., is there high pollution, what type of gases, etc.
I think that's just such a great story, Paulette, and it's such a classic Harwell story. The folks down the street on the Harwell campus applying their minds and technology. I mean, Earth observation space technology to position a beehive. I mean, I think it's just wonderful. So if people talk in future about the smart beehive, you heard it here first.
Well, it's quite interesting because there are more and more people having an interest, especially during lockdown, having an interest in hive, honey, and keeping bees. So it would be good to become more involved with the local community and assist you in any way we can throughout the project. So we are interested in talking to a number of local beekeepers to understand what the challenges are that you're facing as a beekeeper. And sometimes the type of problems you encounter, maybe the type of pests that you see within your hives. And hopefully together we'll be able to find some solutions that will be beneficial to you, but also help us in our research.
It feels like there's a sort of Oxfordshire army fighting for the bee coming along here. Great. Sorry, Faith.
That's okay. There are just a couple of bits of information here. One is if people would like to know more about the local wildlife action with Mark, you can find a link. Mim's put it on the side here in the chat. It's in the through the Sustainable Wantage website. And Mark's also added a bit of information about what he's mentioning. It's David Henwood that made a presentation to Oxford County Council today about managing verges in a better way. He's an independent councillor for Cowley. I hope he's successful in his campaign. Please consider supporting him. And then we've got a question: if I put holes in the mortar courses of a north-facing wall, presumably a house wall, should this go all the way through to the interwall gap? Question for Roselle.
What if you drill the hole?
That sounds a bit odd.
If you drill the hole yourself with a drill, or if the
presumably, presumably making holes for a bee to go in.
Do you know what? I wouldn't.
I don't know if you want to have bees in the interwall.
Where's Colin?
Colin, do you want to say more, Colin?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this was just if I wanted to put holes into the wall for nesting sites, then the obvious place would be a north-facing wall, in other words, not a weather-facing wall, and whether they needed to go right the way through the actual brick course so that it provided sort of nesting facilities in the intercavity gap, or whether you just went half the way through.
Do you know what? I wouldn't do that if I were you. I think they're really capable of making their own, selecting their own nest sites and excavating it. I think you could fill your wall full of holes and end up with no bees, just because we don't really fully understand their requirements, I think you do better off leaving undisturbed areas in your garden for them to nest and winter in. But not only that, but they like the really soft mortar of old houses. I don't know if your house is old, but they would be perfectly capable of creating their own nest spaces in walls.
Yeah, I've just spent, I've just had a large amount of money spent on my weather-facing wall, sort of pointing it to get rid of the holes. So I'm just kind of, it was just, kind of one or two holes here and there. I wasn't planning to kind of perforate the entire building.
Okay.
Leave them to it.
Paulette, I think that's another challenge for your project, to communicate with the bees to figure out what sort of holes they like people to drill in their north-facing walls.
That's a challenge, isn't it?
There's someone else says, what about the roundabouts? I don't know whether they mean using roundabout and making them as biodiverse as possible. Whether we're not doing that at the moment, I guess we're not. That was from Keith Dickens. I don't know if he wants to add
sorry,
anything.
I couldn't unmute myself. Yes, use the roundabouts because they look a right disgrace, and use them for pollination. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
In the same way as road verges, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any more questions. There's a useful link people might want to make a note of to contact Paulette if, as beekeepers, you wanted to get involved with her work. But I think that's it, unless anyone has anything else to say.
Faith, should we wrap up, but just do a shout out for next month with Peter?
Yeah. So Peter Allen, who's an astrophysicist, is going to tell us why we are stardust next time, talking about how all the atoms in our bodies come from inside stars originally, and about the origin of elements and so on. So he's going to talk in November, and then we'll have a break in December.
Wow.
And on that note,
Should be an interesting one. Yeah.
Roselle, there are people who heading off the call, but saying thank you for a super talk, which
Great talk,
I'm
yeah.
certain everybody is in absolute agreement with. We are very lucky to have had you speak to us tonight. So thank you very, very much indeed. What was the phrase? Be active.
Active.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, I'll come and see you soon. We'll have a look and see what you're up to. Hear from Mark well, actually, what I would say is that we're going to start our autumn webinars series soon in mid-November. So keep an eye on our website. And Faith, if it's okay with you, I'll circulate talks and things so that you can circulate them to the network and anyone can join, and they're free. So on a whole range of subjects.
Yes, I can I'll put a link in the next newsletter.